ask you, the three of you, how do you define design thinking in your organization?
At EY especially, I think the challenge has been getting people to understand design is more than the beautifying aspects that they typically think about. And what we sort of try and do is talk more about design as a broad way of thinking. So the mindset about how you approach problems, how do you engage, and how do you build collaboration.
When we set up the team on PayMe, the first thing we did is to avoid the term service design because it throws people in the wrong definition of design. It is about just designing a solution to a problem. So we called ourselves customer experience, and we avoided anything to do with terminology that may throw people into a smaller bucket that actually service design might be.
We have not ever used the term design thinking at the Post, certainly not in the last 4 years since I've been there. The big mindset change for us was to become a user-first organization.
So for us, it was not shying away from that term. I think that term needs to mature. And the way to mature it is to widen its output and widen the impact that it has in the organization. And then design can maybe make its entrance through the front door.
The question is, does the audience understand what it is when you're talking about design? And does it understand the value that it's creating? Because if you can't communicate that, then the challenge is you're not going to get the other side of the table to really understand what it is that you're trying to achieve.
The design thinking is not just for designers. It is for an entire organization. The accountability and the responsibility of understanding a customer and innovating because of that understanding should belong to everyone. So I think making sure that we don't use terms that need to be disambiguated is really, really important transformation.
So maybe one of the learnings summarizing what you guys are saying is maybe before you even start this is to make sure your organization has a common understanding of what you're talking about, right? Whatever you want to call it. How do you get internal buy-in?
Take a manageable problem, take something that you may have seen or experienced working for that organization. It doesn't have to be a customer problem to start with. It might well be an internal stakeholders issue. Start with that and focus and pull whatever tool you need to focus on that problem and solve it. And focus on what the output is. Don't talk about the process. That we've learned on PayMe is also sort of find your advocates. Choose and find the people that are more sort of maybe open to the idea of shifting the way of working, of trying something new, of approaching a problem from a different angle, and leverage those as much as possible. One of the key foundation or culture that we have within our team is we're not pretending to do everything.
One of the things that we're doing here at Wavespace is we're building this rotation system where the business comes and sits with us for 3 to 6 months, and they work as part of the design team. And they take sort of some of those learnings and infuse them back into their own lines of business. So we're not trying to teach them a process, we're trying to expose them to it and get them engaged in actually working through challenges and opportunities in the same way that we would.
And you have to accept in a large organization, you're going to have groups of people, and in some organizations, they might be large, that are never going to truly buy in. And the second is that this thing takes time. And this is just not going to be an overnight shift. But for us at the Post, it's come really in 4 different steps. And we're still in parallel working on all 4 of these steps. The first one is a cultural and cadence change. Those 2 things are tied, are connected at the hip. Changing the cadence of your company is changing the culture of your company. The second piece is training. We had to retrain pretty much our entire organization. And it's not retraining them on necessary process, but on new skill sets necessary. And to make, by the way, learning and continuous learning an endemic activity at the Post. The third piece is talent regeneration. Over the course of the last nearly 4 years, there has been a very natural regeneration of the Post's employee base, and it will likely continue. And that regeneration is really, really important. It's not that the process is not finding who you should be pushing out of the business. It is finding who you should be bringing into the business. And the fourth one, and I would argue the most important one, is communication. Because all of this change, if it's not paired with the discipline of communication, the iterative process of communication, it's just not going to be understood.
Well, I think it's also up to the practitioners around design thinking to open up to different languages and force themselves not to hide behind the design language and the design process, and start to also understand and talk the language of technology, talk the language of the business. I think it's about breaking the silos, and often in large organization, it's really important that whatever practitioner you may have in this field to sit as across the business as possible, not to be too within a vertical functional team, because you lose that holistic view, which is quite fundamental to understanding the picture and solve those problems, internal or external.
The next question has to do with training, like in terms of capability building, organizational capability building. What are some of the do's and don'ts, like from your experiences?
And so we run kind of multiple workshops for consultants across the business, and those are not limited to particular rank or particular levels. And so there's a structured approach there to actually it amounts to EY credentials, and you get a badge at the end of it saying you completed it. But one of the things that we're constantly talking about in that is that having completed a design thinking training session does not make you kind of a designer or a design thinker. What it's done is expose you potentially to a different way of working, a different way of looking at the world, a different way of approaching problems. And what we try and do is kind of reframe the problem and think about the tools and techniques that we've kind of exposed you to. Use those in your day-to-day kind of activities. So use those in terms of planning your next kind of team meeting together. Use those in terms of how you might reshape the typical approach to a proposal you might put in front of a client. Try kind of the small things first.
Along the way, involve the customers as much as possible. We're incredibly fortunate at PayMe that we have a very wide user base in Hong Kong, and we've actually recruited what we call our PayMe insiders. So we leverage them in many ways, from asking them to come in and have a chat with us, through to panels and survey, to giving them prototypes, giving them early access to some of our features. And that really gives us, I guess, two things. One, it gives us a great, confidence in that what we're doing is on the right path, and we can iterate before even releasing it to the market. I guess reassures also the business stakeholders that when we do release those features and functionality, their chances of getting traction is actually much greater. And I guess the third, which is probably the most important, come back to the mindset change, is you actually get the customer voice into the organization. One of the things we try to do as much as we can is to get not just the practitioners into design thinking in front of those customers, but getting our product team and our technology team in front of customers. Seeing them struggle with the technology will resonate much more to a technology team than we trying to explain that later.
But the one thing that we've learned is that not everyone needs, at least not at the beginning, not everyone needs to know everything. And so what we've tried to do increasingly is pick those, what Chris called design elements, sort of the building blocks that need to all fit together and that can creatively be kind of recomposed on the fly for different problems. But I think to begin with, we've really focused on folks owning, having the accountability and having expertise in different parts of the chain.
In terms of training, is it mandatory in your organization, or is it like if they like to participate? How does that work?
It's not mandatory. It's obviously strongly encouraged, and we measure this. And the accountability sits at the department head level. So on a monthly basis, we publish reports for the department heads to show the number of training hours that their teams have been engaged in. The sort of average training hours per employee, stuff like that. And we measure leadership. As part of leadership, the measure is development.
The typical staff who didn't used to kind of expose themselves to design or research or things like that are now becoming more interested in it because they can see an avenue where it contributes to work that they are doing that they didn't think they would be involved in before.
Actually, out of 100% of your sort of training, really 10% happens in the classroom, and the rest really happens with peer-to-peer and just doing it.
So previously, some of you mentioned bringing the customer voice into the organization, which is like customer insights, right? So how do you guys do it in terms of qualitative, quantitative? Some of you mentioned survey panels, like meeting users face-to-face, interviewing. Like, can you share with us how you do it?
We obviously do quantitative research through surveys. We also, I think, part of research, which is also an important element of research, is data. So we have a data and insights team. I think a lot of organizations have probably more data than they know what to do with. So it is in itself a challenge to bring data into the equation. It's one that we're still, I guess, learning. Sort of how do we educate ourselves to know what to do with data, how to bring data and qualitative research together. To bring, I guess, what's relevant for the organization to make decisions on. So we're trying to go and meet customers. So PayMe has both sides, the consumer side and the business side. So we try, for example, with the SMEs in Hong Kong to, instead of inviting them in, we actually go to their offices. So we try and meet the business owners, the cashiers, people who are sort of anything to do with the PayMe sort of service. We try to meet them in their context to try and understand, I guess, in visu, what they are going through, what the challenges are on the day-to-day basis.
In the past, the way that we would understand customers is qualitative, right? We would sit down and have a bunch of focus groups and ask them what they think about the brand and the news and how they consume and what pages do they flip through. And then the quantitative part were surveys that were effectively, panel surveys, right? You had a small percentage of our users answer our questions, and then we use those to confirm the hypotheses we developed because of the qualitative research. So qualitative was much more important. Quantitative, because it was panel, was more affirming than anything else, or confirming. We rebuilt the data stack. That was the first step of our transformation, by the way, was completely rebuilding our data stack. So we're capturing every single event, every single second of every single user's experience on SCMP's platforms. And so there's so much data, quantitative leads everything. Because the difference between quantitative in the past in surveys is that we still had to assume, we had to figure out when they were telling the truth, when they were just telling us what they think we want to hear. With data, with the kind of data we have now, we don't have to guess. Because we know exactly how the users use our product. We know exactly what the users need at what moments in time for what purposes. And the qualitative piece, those focus groups, they are really just to provide color and context to what we're already seeing in the data. And maybe this is controversial. I actually think that data can help us empathize with the user, because it is so darn clear now how the user uses the product and why. And everything at the post now starts with data. It is going from descriptive data to now, hopefully in the future, prescriptive and then predictive data, where the analysis actually defines what we build next.
That's interesting. So how about in terms of design thinking for empathy? A lot of the emphasis has been on the ethnographic aspect, right? Is to kind of study people, live with people. Of course, quantitative is great, but one question is can qualitative actually scale also? Any thoughts?
The biggest journey for us in research is actually to try and move it upstream to before those assumptions are being made, before those hypotheses are being formed. What can research provide to help us informing those hypotheses in the first place? So I think for us it's been, and that's where, to Gary's point, a combination of data centricity, because that will bring the robustness that you need to make those, mindset to shift, while also qualitative give you the flavor and the depth and the real customer voice that you may need to sort of pepper that. So for us, this has been really where research has been trying to shift.
So I think one of the things that we've done over here in the last couple of years is build a foresight practice, which is really about looking to kind of where are we going to be in 5 to 10 years, so longer term horizon, taking the qualitative and quantitative work that we do in other spaces and blending those together, and building a map of kind of where an organization or where a particular trend is likely to sort of take us to in the next 5 to 10 years, I think is really important. So there's early signals leading to a longer term perspective, rather than just looking at kind of the narrow band that we have sort of within a 1 year product window. Some of the businesses are actually really deeply considering what are they today and what are they going to be in the future, because a large kind of traditional part of their business is completely fallen away.
How, like Gary mentioned, how data can be predictive. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
There's a spectrum of how analytics is used in an organization. Initially, it is to report on what has happened in the past. The first use of it is to understand the past, and then it hopefully will inform your actions in the future. When it becomes prescriptive, what that means is that the decisions that one makes on how to improve business, how to improve operations, how to improve user experience is based off of the analytic output. So it's not just about looking at the past, but it's saying if we make this change, it will lead to this improvement in output and productivity. Okay, so that becomes prescriptive. The predictive part of it is that there are going to be patterns that we as human beings cannot see, especially when we have a huge amount of data, like the kind of data that we collect at the Post now. That doesn't matter how large of an army of analysts you have, you may not pick up these kinds of patterns of user behavior. And that's when artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities of an organization will lead to predictive analytics, trends that will automatically be floated to the top. So that's the progress. We are in the middle of this process. So I think prescriptive analytics is sort of what we're developing right now. Predictive analytics, I think, is still at least a year or two down the road.
So the last question to this is, we talked about earlier to engage employees and customers, but with COVID and the pandemic, like, how do you guys deal with this? Has anything changed in your organization?
I don't think any of us had a choice to change. We all had to change whatever jobs we're in. I think there are some great tools out there to encourage collaboration. It has its limitation. That there is definitely the need to spend time physically together. When you have somebody face to face, you can definitely uncover an awful lot more. You can see their emotions. Yeah, you can see their facial expressions. You can dig into an hesitation that they've sort of really quickly sort of went through. So for us, while technology has helped in maintaining a certain level of collaboration, and the ability for us to still have customer voice into the organization. And that's not just with customer. As a team, myself and our team, we work an awful lot better when we are together in the room with a whiteboard, exchanging ideas, being able to reach our other team, breaking those silos day in, day out by just having those conversations over a coffee.
So what kind of tools you're using, like, to engage with your employees and customers?
But I think what we've identified is that there are advantages to being a distributed remote workforce, and there are advantages to being an in-person organization. I think if I were to hypothesize now, very, very publicly, where I would like to get to for the organization is to use those two circumstances differently going forward. So there's a productivity aspect, but then you're missing the creativity and the counsel and the emotional support, but also the debate that is necessary for a high-functioning organization, especially one that is innovating. You're missing that if you're not together. So hopefully for the post in the future, we're able to mix those two things and we become an organization that can operate in two forms, regardless of whether or not we're restricted.
What do we do in terms of building teams going forward? Do we really need people to be co-located with us, or can we kind of build in a much better virtual team? So it's less about sort of the best candidate you have in your location, more about the best candidate who happens to be anywhere in the world. And can we build sort of a much more virtualized workforce that way, and kind of reduce potentially, the footprint that we have in real estate?
How do you train the top people, especially in a culture where it's kind of top down?
I think measurement is key. So one thing that if you sit at the top of the organization, one thing you do want is being able to show that your investment into the people and technology to embed design thinking is actually fruitful from a business standpoint. And that's often the hardest thing for design thinking is measurability. So I guess there's three things we try to do on PayMe to address that. The first one is what we call limiting the cost of error. So making a mistake in technology is expensive. It's expensive overall, but I think particularly when you work on the technology digital product, a feature, a functionality, a release can be in the millions of dollars. And I think when you start talking the budget associated with a mistake and removing that mistake from happening, or making a mistake much smaller than it would have been, which is what design thinking tried to do, certainly the senior part of the organization really listens to that kind of argument. I guess the second is customer satisfaction. When we release something on PayMe, we've gone through at least 2 or 3 rounds of validation with users and customer. So there's much less anxiety. It's much more of a soft, I guess, measurement, but there's much less anxiety from senior management that we are sort of pitching in the dark.
I think a lot of the work that we do here involves senior management from the client side. When we go through the actual journey of project work as well, we involve them in that process. We kind of work with them to make sure they're part of that process to experience what's going on. And the point earlier on about sort of, how do we get sort of customer input into things? A lot of the sessions that we used to do physically here, we would invite customers to be part of the conversation with the client. And so bringing that sort of the voice of the customer directly into the conversation as you're workshopping together, making all 3 of them part of the collaborative process, I think is really important. So again, we're not trying to train them. I think it's trying to expose them.
There's this fear of failure, and it is very apparent, has been very apparent to me that it is cultural here in Hong Kong. And we have to get rid of that. We have to understand that there are types of failure, or at the very least, there are actions that can be taken as a result of failure that actually makes the organization better. The leaders are convinced of that, and their actions mirror the idea that I can try, I can take risks, and I can fail, and I can learn from it, and we as an organization will actually be better because of it. Then their reports, and then their reports will be more willing to take risk.
I think it's about learning. It's about drawing successes out of those learnings. And that's where the focus should be. So there shouldn't necessarily, I mean, it's also important to get the buy-in for the line managers of people who do take part in these kind of things to make sure that they're protected and the line manager has given them the green light to experiment.
But resetting those metrics and moving them away from the pure kind of cold, hard clinical financial numbers, I think creates some of that space, right? If you're going to create a culture, you have to understand that some of these things, like the rate of failure and things like that, are going to be important metrics to consider, and to balance those against the sort of the cold, hard clinical financial, the typical commercial metrics. I think that helps, again, create that space where people don't feel as constrained as before, because the the weight on their shoulders is lifted a little bit.